There is a moment when an empath stops fighting for an explanation, and that moment is far more powerful than anger. It is the moment when they finally see the pattern behind the pain. An empath can forgive a mistake. They can forgive a bad day, harsh words, emotional distance, fear, insecurity, and even behavior that once seemed impossible to accept. They may spend months trying to understand what happened inside the other person before deciding what it means for the relationship. But forgiveness has a limit that most people never notice. It can survive mistakes, but it struggles to survive repeated choices. It can survive pain, but it begins to disappear when pain becomes a pattern. And this is where the story takes a darker turn, because the empath's breaking point is usually not the moment they get hurt. It is the moment they realize the person hurting them already knew better. They explained their feelings, they gave another chance, they tried to communicate. They looked for reasons, they searched for the good in that person even when the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. But eventually something changes inside them. They stop asking why you did it. They start asking why they keep accepting it. In this video, you will learn what actually pushes a deeply understanding person toward the point of no return. Why repeated disrespect can destroy trust more deeply than one major mistake. Why an empath may become silent after spending so long explaining themselves. And why their final withdrawal does not always mean they stopped caring. You will also discover the difference between forgiveness, trust, reconciliation, and access, and why an empath can forgive someone while still deciding that person will never receive the same place in their life again. Most importantly, we are going to uncover the real thing they struggle to forgive, because it is not simply betrayal. It is what repeated betrayal reveals about your choices, your intentions, and the value you placed on their patience. Stay until the end, because the final realization explains why the quietest departure can sometimes be the most permanent one. Welcome to our channel, and if you want more powerful insights into empathy, relationships, human behavior, and emotional boundaries, make sure you subscribe and stay with us, because this is where we go beyond what people do, and uncover why they finally reach the point where they stop coming back. There is a difference between being hurt once and realizing that you are being hurt in the same way again and again. And that difference is where the empath begins to change. A person who feels deeply often does not judge people quickly. They may notice the behavior, feel the pain, and still search for the reason behind it. Instead of immediately deciding that someone is bad, they may ask what happened to that person, what they are carrying inside, what fear might be controlling them, or what experience could have shaped the way they behave. They may look at an angry reaction and wonder whether that anger is covering insecurity. They may see emotional distance and wonder whether the person is afraid of closeness. They may experience disrespect and still think there could be something underneath it that they do not understand yet. This is one of the reasons a deeply empathetic person can remain in difficult relationships longer than other people might expect. They are not always ignoring the warning signs. In many cases, they are studying them, explaining them, and trying to place them inside a larger story. They see the behavior, but they also see the person behind the behavior. That ability can be beautiful because it allows them to give grace where others might immediately give judgment. But it can also become dangerous when understanding starts replacing discernment. The empath may tell themselves that the person is struggling. Maybe they are under pressure. Maybe they have never learned how to communicate properly. Maybe they are dealing with wounds they have never faced. Maybe they did not mean what they said. Maybe they will realize what they have done. Maybe the next conversation will be different. Maybe the next opportunity will finally give them a reason to change. And because the empath can see so many possible explanations, they can also create so many opportunities for forgiveness. One chance becomes another chance. Another chance becomes one more conversation. One more conversation becomes another period of waiting. Slowly, the relationship can become a place where the empath is constantly explaining the other person's behavior, while receiving very little explanation for their own pain. This is where one of the most important distinctions in this entire subject appears. Understanding why someone behaves badly does not make the behavior acceptable. Knowing where someone's anger comes from does not mean you have to stand in front of it. Understanding someone's fear does not mean you have to become responsible for calming it. Recognizing someone's wounds does not mean you have to allow those wounds to become weapons against you. Compassion can explain behavior, but it cannot erase consequences. This is the line that many highly empathetic people struggle to draw because their first instinct is often to understand before they protect themselves. They can look at another person's brokenness and immediately think about healing. They can look at another person's insecurity and immediately think about reassurance. They can look at another person's fear and immediately think about patience. But after enough time, a painful realization begins to form. A person's pain may explain why they hurt you, but it does not change the fact that you were hurt. And when the same behavior keeps happening, the question changes. It is no longer only, why are they doing this? It becomes, what am I supposed to do with what they keep doing? That question is where empathy begins turning into discernment. The empath starts realizing that intentions and consequences are not the same thing. Someone may not intend to destroy a relationship, but if their repeated actions keep damaging trust, the result still matters. Someone may genuinely have emotional wounds, but if they refuse to take responsibility for how those wounds affect other people, compassion alone cannot repair the damage. Someone may have a difficult past, but their past cannot become a permanent excuse for creating a painful present. This does not make the empath less compassionate. It makes their compassion more intelligent. And that distinction becomes even clearer when the empath is faced with a genuine mistake. A mistake is painful, but a mistake can still leave room for repair. A person can say, I was wrong. They can recognize what happened. They can understand the damage. They can take responsibility without turning the conversation into an excuse. They can show remorse through behavior rather than words alone. Most importantly, they can change what happens next. That is what gives forgiveness a place to live. Forgiveness becomes possible when the person who caused the damage is not asking the injured person to simply forget it. They are showing through their actions that they understand why it cannot happen again. There is a major difference between someone who makes a mistake and someone who repeatedly makes the same choice while changing the explanation every time. One creates an opportunity for repair, the other creates a pattern, and patterns eventually become more powerful than promises. This is why an empath can forgive something that would surprise other people. They may forgive the harsh sentence spoken during an emotional argument because they can see the remorse afterward. They may forgive distance when they understand that the other person needed time and eventually returned with honesty. They may forgive a failure when the person accepts responsibility and works to make things right. They may even forgive betrayal when there is genuine accountability and a serious attempt to rebuild what was broken. Forgiveness does not always mean the wound was small. Sometimes it means the empath saw enough responsibility to believe that the relationship could still become different. But the real problem begins when the same wound keeps returning with a different excuse. The first time, they may think it was a mistake. The second time, they may think there was a misunderstanding. The third time, they may start questioning themselves. They may wonder whether they are being too sensitive. They may wonder whether they expected too much. They may wonder whether they communicated their feelings clearly enough. This is one of the hidden costs of repeated emotional disappointment. The person being hurt can eventually begin investigating themselves instead of investigating the pattern. They start asking whether their reaction is the problem. They start wondering whether they should be more patient. They give the other person the benefit of the doubt so many times that the benefit of the doubt begins to feel like a responsibility. But eventually something becomes impossible to ignore. If the same behavior continues after the pain has been clearly communicated, then the issue is no longer simply that the person does not understand. They have information now. They know what hurts. They know what damages trust. They know what makes the empath pull away. They have been told. They have watched the consequences. And if they continue doing it, the empath is forced to consider a possibility they desperately wanted to avoid. Maybe the problem was never that the other person did not understand. Maybe the problem is that understanding was never enough to make them choose differently. That realization can be devastating because it changes the meaning of every previous conversation. The empath remembers the moments when they explained themselves. They remember trying to be calm. They remember giving another opportunity. They remember believing the promise that things would change. They remember the words, the apologies, the emotional conversations, and the moments when they convinced themselves that this time would be different. Then they look at the pattern. And suddenly, the pattern speaks louder than every promise. This is where repeated disrespect becomes more painful than one isolated mistake. One incident can be explained as an event. A pattern begins to feel like a decision. One incident may cause the empath to ask, what happened? A pattern causes them to ask, why does this keep happening? One incident can create disappointment. Repeated incidents can change the way they see the entire relationship. They stop evaluating individual moments and start evaluating the system. They notice how conflicts begin. They notice how apologies happen. They notice whether accountability appears. They notice whether the same behavior returns after the apology. They notice whether the other person only changes when they are afraid of losing access. They notice whether promises become smaller over time, while expectations placed on them become larger. And this is where empathy becomes discernment, in a very practical way. The empath stops listening only to what the person says and starts watching what the person repeatedly does. They stop asking whether the apology sounds sincere and start asking whether the behavior has changed. They stop measuring love by intensity and start measuring it by consistency. They stop being impressed by emotional promises and start paying attention to emotional responsibility. This shift may look cold from the outside, but internally it can be one of the most difficult changes they have ever made. They are not suddenly becoming heartless. They are learning that their heart cannot be the only evidence used to decide whether a relationship is safe. Then comes an even deeper realization. Sometimes the hardest thing for an empath to forgive is not the action itself. It is discovering that the other person knew it would hurt and chose to do it anyway. That is different from an accidental wound. If someone accidentally crosses a boundary they did not know existed, there is room for education. But when the boundary has been clearly explained, when the pain has already been witnessed, when the consequences have already been discussed, and the same choice is made again, the empath experiences the situation differently. The question becomes less about ignorance and more about priority. They begin wondering, if you knew this would hurt me, why did you still choose it? That question can sit inside the mind for a long time because it touches the deepest part of trust. Trust is not simply believing that someone will never make a mistake. Trust is also believing that your pain matters to them. When someone understands your pain and still repeatedly chooses behavior that creates it, the empath may begin to feel that their emotional safety was never given the same importance that they gave the other person's comfort. And this realization can change the relationship at its foundation. The empath may have tolerated a lot because they believed the person cared. They may have believed that the mistakes were connected to fear, immaturity, confusion, or unresolved wounds. But once they realize the person knows the cost and continues anyway, those explanations begin losing their power. The empath can still understand the reason. That is the painful part. They may understand the insecurity. They may understand the fear. They may understand the childhood wound. They may understand the attachment pattern. They may understand the emotional defenses. They may understand almost everything. But understanding no longer changes the conclusion. This is one of the lesser-known parts of emotional detachment. Detachment does not always begin when someone stops understanding you. Sometimes it begins when they understand you completely and finally realize that understanding you will not change what they need to do. They can see your wounds and still walk away. They can recognize your fear and still refuse to let that fear control their life. They can understand your behavior and still hold you responsible for it. That is not a loss of empathy. It is the development of boundaries. Before that boundary becomes visible, however, there is usually one final attempt to understand the relationship. The empath may become unusually quiet. They may replay conversations in their head. They may remember exact moments that once felt insignificant. They may compare what was promised with what actually happened. They may revisit old arguments and wonder whether they missed an important detail. They may ask themselves whether they were unfair. They may wonder if the relationship could have survived if they had spoken differently, reacted differently, waited longer, or given more space. This internal process can take much longer than anyone around them realizes. From the outside, their final decision may look sudden. From the inside, it may have been forming for months. Their silence may appear to begin on one particular day, but emotionally, the silence may have started much earlier. It may have started with the first moment they stopped believing the explanation. It may have grown when the second promise was broken. It may have deepened when the same apology returned without any meaningful change. By the time the empath becomes visibly distant, they may already have spent countless hours processing what happened. That is why their final withdrawal can confuse people. The person who once explained everything suddenly explains nothing. The person who once asked for reassurance stops asking. The person who once wanted to resolve every misunderstanding no longer feels the same urgency. But this is not necessarily because they have nothing left to say. Sometimes they have said everything already. They have explained the boundary. They have described the pain. They have offered opportunities for repair. They have waited. They have listened. They have tried again. Eventually, repeating the same conversation begins to feel like participating in the same cycle, and that is when expectation starts disappearing. This is the real point of no return. It is not necessarily the moment the empath becomes angry. It is not necessarily the moment they stop loving someone. It is the moment they stop expecting that person to become different. That shift is subtle, but it is enormous. As long as someone expects change, they remain emotionally invested in the possibility of a different future. They wait for the apology. They wait for the realization. They wait for the person to finally understand what they have been trying to communicate. They imagine what the relationship could become if the other person finally chose differently. But when expectation disappears, the future begins to look different. The empath stops building their emotional life around potential. They stop thinking about who the person could become and start accepting who the person has repeatedly shown themselves to be. That acceptance can hurt more than anger because anger still contains energy. Anger still says, I want you to understand. Expectation still says, I believe you can change. But emotional exhaustion says, I no longer need you to become different for me to make my decision. That is when the relationship begins dying emotionally. The empath may still have feelings. They may still remember the good moments. They may still care about what happens to the other person. They may even hope that the other person heals one day. But they stop making their own peace dependent on that healing. This is where forgiveness takes on a completely different meaning. Forgiveness is often misunderstood as allowing someone back into the same position they once occupied. But forgiveness, trust, reconciliation, and access are different things. A person can forgive without trusting again. A person can understand without returning. A person can wish someone well without giving them another opportunity to repeat the same behavior. This is one of the strongest boundaries an empath can learn. They do not have to hate someone in order to leave them. They do not need revenge in order to protect themselves. They do not need to prove that the other person was evil. They only need to recognize that the relationship no longer works in the form it has taken. And when they reach that understanding, their behavior begins to change. They may stop arguing because they are no longer trying to win the argument. They may stop explaining because they are no longer trying to convince someone to care. They may stop asking questions because they have already received the answer through repeated behavior. They may stop checking for signs of change because they have decided to judge the relationship by what is actually happening rather than what might happen later. Their silence can feel confusing because silence is often interpreted as punishment. But sometimes silence is not an attempt to control another person. Sometimes it is the final stage of emotional exhaustion. The empath has reached a place where every additional explanation feels like another request for the other person to acknowledge something they have already demonstrated they do not want to acknowledge. So they become quiet. Not because their feelings disappeared overnight, but because their belief in the usefulness of another conversation disappeared. And this is where the person who once gave endless emotional access begins to become selective. They may still answer politely. They may still care. They may still have compassion, but access is no longer automatic. Their attention becomes protected. Their emotional energy becomes protected. Their time becomes protected. They begin realizing that being compassionate does not mean being permanently available. They begin realizing that someone can deserve understanding without deserving unlimited access to them. This is also where they stop needing the other person to admit what they did. Earlier acknowledgement may have felt essential. The empath may have wanted the other person to finally say, I hurt you. They may have wanted an apology that explained everything. They may have believed that if the other person could only understand their pain, the relationship could finally heal. But healing changes the requirement. At some point, the empath realizes that another person's confession is not necessary for their experience to be real. They do not need permission to trust what they felt. They do not need agreement to recognize a pattern. They do not need an apology before establishing a boundary. They do not need someone else to validate their decision before they make it. That is emotional independence, and it often arrives quietly. The empath who once needed closure from the other person begins creating closure within themselves. They stop waiting for the perfect final conversation. They stop believing that one final explanation will magically organize everything that happened. They accept that some relationships end without a satisfying answer. Some people will never fully understand the damage they caused. Some apologies will never come. Some promises will remain broken. And some questions will never receive the answer the empath wanted. Yet life can still move forward. In fact, sometimes it moves forward precisely because the empath stops demanding that the past become different before they allow themselves to continue. This is where something important happens to their identity. The empath does not necessarily become less caring. They become more selective about where their care goes. They do not lose their ability to understand people. They stop using that ability as a reason to tolerate everything. They do not stop seeing the pain inside other people. They stop believing that seeing someone's pain makes them responsible for carrying it. Their compassion develops a boundary. Their empathy develops discernment. Their love develops standards. And this transformation is often misunderstood by the people who benefited from the old version of them. Those people may say the empath changed. They may wonder why the person who once tolerated so much now refuses to tolerate the same behavior. They may remember how patient the empath used to be. They may remember how many chances they received. They may be confused by the fact that the empath no longer reacts with the same emotional intensity. But the change did not happen because the empath suddenly became cruel. It happened because they finally understood the cost of remaining the same. They learned that endless patience can become self-abandonment. They learned that compassion without boundaries can become exhaustion. They learned that forgiveness without accountability can become permission for the same cycle to continue. And they learned that love cannot survive indefinitely when only one person is protecting the relationship. So the empath begins to choose differently. They stop evaluating people only by their potential. They begin evaluating them by their patterns. They stop asking whether someone has a good heart underneath their behavior, and begin asking whether that good heart is actually reflected in the way they treat people. They stop giving unlimited credit for intentions, while ignoring repeated consequences. They stop allowing one beautiful conversation to erase months of painful behavior. They start noticing consistency. They start noticing accountability. They start noticing whether someone can accept responsibility without becoming defensive. They start noticing whether an apology produces change or simply resets the relationship until the next incident. This is the point where empathy becomes discernment, compassion becomes boundaries, and love becomes selective. The empath may still be capable of giving deeply, but they are no longer willing to give blindly. They can forgive a mistake because a mistake can be repaired. They can forgive fear because fear can be confronted. They can forgive immaturity when immaturity is followed by growth. But repeated harm combined with repeated excuses begins to tell a different story. It tells them that their patience has become part of the other person's strategy for avoiding consequences, even if that strategy was never consciously planned. And once the empath sees that, the entire emotional equation changes. They stop thinking, "How can I help this person become better?" and begin thinking, "What kind of person do I become when I keep accepting this?" That question reaches deeper than the relationship itself. It brings the focus back to the empath. For so long their attention may have been directed outward. What does this person need? Why are they distant? Why are they angry? Why are they afraid? Why did they behave this way? What can I say to make things better? But eventually the questions turn inward. What do I need? What am I accepting? What does this relationship require from me? What is it costing me? What happens to my peace every time I ignore what I already know? And once those questions become impossible to avoid, the empath begins seeing the relationship through a different lens. They are no longer trying to rescue the connection at any cost. They are trying to understand whether the connection deserves to continue in its current form. That is a profound shift because the empath is no longer measuring love by how much pain they can survive. They are measuring love by whether there is enough safety, respect, accountability, and consistency for both people to remain emotionally present. And when those things disappear again and again, forgiveness can no longer carry the entire relationship by itself. The empath may forgive, they may release the anger, they may stop replaying the past, they may even genuinely hope that the other person finds happiness. But forgiveness no longer means returning to the same position. It means letting go without reopening the same door. It means accepting what happened without allowing it to define every day that comes after it. It means understanding that peace sometimes requires distance, and distance does not automatically mean hatred. The person they were with you may not be completely gone. Their warmth may still exist, their compassion may still exist, their ability to love may still exist. What disappears is the version of them that believed love required unlimited tolerance, the version that kept explaining after the explanation had already been given, the version that kept waiting for potential to become reality. The version that confused being understanding with being endlessly available. That version eventually becomes tired, and when it finally steps away, the empath does not necessarily leave with hatred in their heart, they leave with clarity. They understand that the relationship did not end because they stopped caring. In many cases, it ended because they finally cared enough about themselves to stop participating in a pattern that kept hurting them. They no longer need to punish anyone. They no longer need to prove that they were right. They no longer need the final argument. They simply recognize that the same cycle cannot continue if they stop participating in it. And once they understand that, their empathy does not disappear. It becomes wiser. Their compassion does not disappear. It becomes protected. Their love does not disappear. It becomes intentional. They can still feel deeply without allowing every feeling to become an obligation. They can still understand someone without allowing that understanding to erase accountability. They can still forgive someone without handing them the same access again. They can still remember the good without pretending the bad never happened. And they can still care about someone while accepting that caring does not always mean staying. This is the transformation that most people miss. The empath does not become a different person because they stopped forgiving. They become a more balanced version of the person they were always capable of becoming. Their heart remains open, but the door is no longer unlocked for everyone. Their compassion remains strong, but it now has boundaries. Their understanding remains deep, but it is no longer used to excuse repeated harm. And once they learn that difference, the relationship can never return to what it was before, because the empath is no longer looking at the other person through hope alone. They are looking through evidence. They are no longer asking what the relationship could become. They are paying attention to what it has consistently been. And when that realization settles deeply enough, the point of no return does not need an announcement. It does not need a dramatic ending. It can happen quietly inside a person who finally realizes that understanding someone was never the problem. The problem was believing that understanding them required abandoning themselves. The deepest lesson is this: an empath does not reach the point of no return because their heart suddenly becomes empty. They reach it because their heart finally becomes honest. They can forgive the mistake. They can understand the fear. They can recognize the pain behind someone's behavior. They can even wish that person healing and happiness. But there is a difference between forgiveness and returning to the same place where they were repeatedly wounded. The real betrayal was never just the moment you hurt them. It was the moment you learned that your actions were hurting them, watched them give you another chance, and then continued doing the same thing. That is when patience becomes exhaustion. That is when hope becomes acceptance. And that is when the empath quietly stops waiting for you to become the person they believed you could be. They may still remember you. They may still care about you. They may even miss parts of what you shared. But missing someone does not mean they have to return to the same cycle. Loving someone does not mean giving them unlimited access. Forgiving someone does not mean trusting them the same way again. And understanding someone does not mean abandoning yourself to protect their feelings. Sometimes the strongest decision an empath can make is to walk away without hatred, without revenge, and without needing the other person to understand why. They simply choose peace over another explanation. They choose reality over potential. They choose consistency over promises. And most importantly, they choose themselves without becoming cruel. So if you have ever reached that point, remember this: your empathy was never your weakness. Your ability to understand people was never the problem. Your heart was never too much. You simply needed to learn that a beautiful heart still needs a strong boundary around it. The point of no return is not when you stop loving someone. It is when you finally understand that loving them should never require you to abandon yourself. And perhaps that is the greatest transformation of all. You do not become cold. You become clear. You do not lose your compassion. You learn where to place it. You do not stop caring. You simply stop sacrificing your peace to prove that you care. If this message spoke to something you have experienced, take a moment to let it sink in. And if you want more powerful videos about empathy, human behavior, relationships, emotional boundaries, and the psychology behind the moments when people finally change, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Like this video if you believe that empathy should come with boundaries, and share it with someone who may need to hear that forgiveness does not mean giving someone access to hurt you again, because sometimes the person who walks away quietly is not the person who cared the least. They are the person who finally learned that they deserve to care about themselves too. And once an empath learns that lesson, the old version of them may never come back.